Surviving 10 brutal winters in the high country had taught Gavin to listen carefully to the storms. That year, the gusts screaming along the ridge sounded less like wind and more like a dying horse. Yet it wasn't the bitter cold that nearly killed him. His undoing came in the form of a half-starved valley farm with a collapsed roof and a woman gripping a rifle. Her hands hadn't been warm since a rustler's bullet took her husband's life, and all she did was ask him to stay for dinner. Winter didn't announce itself in the Wyoming territory. It just showed up and started killing things. Gavin knew the signs. The elk had moved down to the river bottoms 2 weeks early. The bark on the aspens was thick, and the sky had carried the bruised metallic color of a cast-iron skillet since Tuesday. It was time to get off the mountain. He loaded his pack mule, a foul-tempered beast named Rust, with the season's pelts, and started the long walk down the switchbacks. Gavin was a man carved out of the landscape he inhabited. He wasn't handsome. His face was a map of bad weather and worse decisions weathered to the texture of old saddle leather. His beard was unkempt, smelling of pine pitch and wood smoke. He liked the high country because the high country didn't lie to you. It didn't smile to your face and steal your cattle. It just froze you to death if you were stupid. He understood that bargain. He preferred it to the company of people. But a man had to eat, and a man needed coffee flour and gunpowder. The valley floor was already dusted in a fine, powdery white when he broke through the timberline. The wind was picking up, carrying a bite that cut straight through his heavy buffalo coat. He was 5 miles from the trading post at Bitter Creek when he saw the heifer. She was young, tangled in a downed section of barbed wire, bleating miserably into the wind. A thin ribbon of blood had frozen against her back leg. Gavin stopped. He spat a stream of black tobacco juice into the snow and swore. He didn't have time for this. The sky was darkening. The real storm was maybe 3 hours away, the kind of blizzard that buried homesteads and suffocated livestock in their stalls. Leaving the animal meant leaving it to the wolves or the freeze. He tied Rust to a fence post and walked over. The heifer thrashed, terrified. "Hold still, you dumb brute." He muttered his voice, a low gravel rasp. He pulled a heavy pair of wire snips from his saddlebag and went to work, his thick, scarred fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Step away from the wire." The voice was female, but there was no softness in it. It was tight, brittle, and backed by the unmistakable mechanical clack of a Winchester lever action chambering around. Gavin didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the Colt on his hip. He finished the cut, let the wire spring back, and slapped the heifer on the rump. She scrambled up and bolted toward a weathered barn 50 yards away. Only then did Gavin stand up and turn around. She stood on the crest of a slight rise, the wind whipping the hem of a heavy faded woolen coat around her boots. She looked small against the vast grey backdrop of the impending storm, but the rifle was seated perfectly against her shoulder. The barrel didn't waver. "You fixing to steal or you fixing to trespass?" she asked. "Wasn't aware untangling a calf counted as either, ma'am," Gavin said. He kept his hands away from his sides, resting them casually on his belt buckle. She lowered the rifle an inch. Not all the way. Just enough to look at him properly. Her name was Molly. He didn't know that yet. He only saw a woman who looked like she had been carrying the weight of the world until her knees were ready to buckle. Her face was gaunt, the skin tight over high cheekbones, her eyes a pale, striking blue that looked bruised by exhaustion. A stray strand of dark hair had escaped her pinned-up braid and plastered itself to her cheek. She was freezing. He could see the micro-tremors in her jaw, the way her knuckles were white around the walnut stock of the rifle. "Fences are down," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, losing the threat and replacing it with a weary resignation. "Wood's rotted. I know it." "Storm's coming," Gavin said. It was a statement of the obvious, But out here, the obvious was what kept you alive. I have eyes, mister. You have firewood. The question hung in the freezing air. Molly stiffened. It was an invasion of privacy, an acknowledgement of her vulnerability. Out here, admitting you weren't prepared for winter was admitting you were ready to die. I manage, she lied. The tightness in her throat betrayed her. Gavin looked past her to the homestead. The cabin was sturdy, built of thick pine logs, but the roof on the lean-to was sagging heavily. The woodpile beside the door was pitiful, a handful of green branches and a few splintered logs. Not enough to last 2 days, let alone a week-long blizzard. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. Manage all you want, Gavin said, stepping toward his mule. But you burn green wood in that stove, you'll choke yourself out before the cold gets you. He took Rust's lead rope. He fully intended to keep walking. Bitter Creek was a few hours away. A hot meal, a glass of cheap whiskey, a bed out of the wind. That was the plan. He didn't owe this woman anything. The world was full of widows trying to hold on to dirt that didn't want them. It wasn't his tragedy to fix. He took 3 steps. The wind hit him, throwing a handful of sharp ice crystals against his face. He stopped. He cursed himself silently, violently. Gavin turned Rust around and started walking toward the sagging barn. "What are you doing?" Molly yelled over the wind, bringing the rifle back up. "Putting my mule up," Gavin called back without stopping. "Then I'm taking your axe. Unless you plan on shooting me, I suggest you go inside and start whatever kindling you got left." Molly stood frozen in the snow. She had spent the last 8 months fighting off debt collectors, predatory neighbors, and the suffocating silence of an empty house. She knew how to handle men who wanted to take from her. She didn't have the first clue what to do with a mountain man who just wanted to chop her wood. Slowly she lowered the rifle. The wind howled, pushing her toward the cabin. The axe was dull. Gavin sat on a stump in the yard, running a whetstone along the chipped steel edge. Sparks didn't fly, but the rhythmic metallic shk-shk was a comforting sound in the biting wind. Molly watched him from the kitchen window. The glass was wavy, distorting his large frame, making him look like a bear wrapped in canvas and buckskin. She held a cup of tepid tea in her hands, trying to draw warmth from the chipped ceramic. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 10 months. Rustlers. A stray bullet in the dark. Since then, the silence of the farm had become a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw breath. She didn't trust the stranger. Trust was a luxury widows couldn't afford. But as she watched him work, a strange knot in her stomach began to loosen. Gavin stood, tested the blade against his thumb, and nodded. He walked to the edge of the timberline behind her cabin, dragging a massive deadwood pine he had felled with a crosscut saw he found rusting in the barn. He swung the axe. Thwack! The sound echoed off the valley walls. The wood split clean. He swung again. Thwack! A rhythm established itself. It wasn't the frantic, desperate chopping of a man rushing against the cold. It was the steady, relentless pace of a man who knew exactly how much energy to expend to get a job done. Molly stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The temperature was dropping fast. The snow wasn't powdery anymore. It was coming down in heavy, wet flakes that stuck to everything. "You're going to freeze out here," she called out. Gavin didn't break his rhythm. He split another log, tossed the halves onto the growing pile, and wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a leather glove. Despite the cold steam rose from his shoulders. "I've been colder," he said. He brought the axe down again. "I don't have money to pay you." She hated saying it. The shame of it tasted like ash in her mouth. She stood on her porch, a proud woman, reduced to charity from a drifting stranger. Gavin paused. He rested the head of the axe on the chopping block and leaned on the handle. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the pride holding her spine rigid. He saw the desperation in the tight line of her mouth. "Didn't ask for money," he said. "Men don't work for free." It was a cynical truth she had learned the hard way. The neighbor who offered to help plow her lower 40 had cornered her in the barn 3 days later, expecting payment in a currency she refused to give. She had broken a pitchfork over his ribs. Gavin held her gaze. His eyes were dark, like the water in a deep mountain lake. "I ain't most men, and I ain't doing this for you. I'm doing it 'cause a storm's coming, and leaving a person to freeze when you have 2 good arms is a sin I don't feel like answering for." He went back to chopping. Molly stood on the porch a moment longer, the wind whipping her hair. Then, without a word, she stepped off the porch and walked to the woodpile. She started gathering the split logs, stacking them in her arms. Gavin stopped mid-swing. "I can carry 'em." "You chop, I carry," she said sharply. "It's my farm. I don't sit while someone else bleeds for it." Gavin let out a short, rough exhale that might have been a laugh. "Suit yourself." For the next 2 hours they worked in total silence. The storm rolled in over the ridge, swallowing the late afternoon sun and turning the sky a bruised, violent purple. The snow came down harder, blindingly thick. The wind tore at them a physical force, trying to push them back into the dirt. Gavin chopped until his muscles burned and his breath plumed in heavy white clouds. Molly carried the wood trip after trip, her arms aching, her fingers numb, despite her woolen mittens. She stacked the wood against the cabin wall, under the overhang building, a fortress of oak and pine against the coming dark. They moved around each other like ghosts. There was an intimacy in the silent labor. They didn't need to speak to coordinate. When he finished a log, she was there to collect the pieces. When she turned back from the stack, he was already splitting to the next. Gavin watched her from the corner of his eye. He admired her grit. She didn't complain. She didn't slow down. She just put her head down and did the work. He hadn't been around a woman in a year. The women he usually encountered in trading towns were hard, transactional smelling of cheap perfume and stale beer. Molly smelled of lye soap wool and the honest metallic scent of cold air. By the time the woodpile was head high and stretching the length of the porch, the daylight was entirely gone. The storm had fully descended, a screaming wall of white. Gavin buried the axe head deep into the stump. He was covered in snow, his beard frozen into white icicles. He beat his arms against his sides to keep the blood flowing. "That'll hold you for 3 weeks," he said, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Molly stood on the porch, a lantern in her hand, casting a weak yellow circle of light against the blizzard. She looked at the mountain of wood. She looked at the man who had built it. "My barn is drafty," she said. "My mule will survive." "I wasn't talking about the mule." Gavin tightened the cinches on his heavy coat. "I have a bedroll. I've slept in worse." "That's a fool's boast," Molly said. Her voice wasn't harsh anymore. It was quiet. It barely reached him, but it stopped him cold. Gavin looked up at her. She was framed in the doorway, the warm, dim glow of the cabin interior behind her. The wind tore between them, a frozen river, trying to keep them apart. He didn't move. He knew the danger of crossing that threshold. Out here in the cold, things were simple. You survived, or you didn't. Inside, there was warmth, and warmth made a man soft. Warmth made a man remember what it felt like to have a home. He had spent 10 years trying to forget. Molly swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. She gripped the wire handle of the lantern until her knuckles ached. "Can you stay for dinner?" The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. Can you stay for dinner? It was a terrifying thing to ask. Molly hadn't set 2 plates on the table since Thomas died. The empty chair opposite her had become a monument to her grief, a silent judge of her lonely, scraping existence. Inviting this massive, wild-looking stranger into her home was a breach of the fortress she had built around herself. But as she looked at him, standing in the teeth of a killing storm, because he refused to let her freeze, the silence inside her house suddenly felt more dangerous than the man outside it. Gavin stood perfectly still. The snow piled on his shoulders. He looked at the barn, a dark, freezing shadow in the whiteout. He looked at Molly. He didn't say yes. He just walked up the steps, stomped the heavy snow from his boots with violent thuds against the floorboards, and ducked his head to clear the low doorframe. Molly stepped back, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The slam cut off the roar of the wind instantly. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. It was a small room. The stove in the corner radiated a desperate dry heat. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the savory, earthy scent of a slow-cooking stew. To Gavin, whose last hot meal was a charred piece of salt pork over a smokeless fire 3 days ago, the smell was nearly intoxicating. He stood awkwardly by the door. He suddenly felt too large for the room. He felt dirty. He stripped off his heavy leather gloves, tucking them into his belt, and began unbuttoning the buffalo coat. "Hang it by the stove," Molly said, her voice entirely devoid of the command she had wielded with the rifle. She was nervous. She moved to the cast-iron stove, picking up a rag to lift the lid off a heavy black pot. Gavin hung his coat on a wooden peg. Beneath it, he wore a faded flannel shirt, suspenders and thick canvas trousers. He was a slab of muscle and old scars, moving with a careful, deliberate slowness in the confined space. He took off his hat, revealing dark, flattened hair, graying at the temples. He stood by the stove, holding his thick, calloused hands over the iron. "Smells good," he rumbled. "It's just rabbit," Molly said, keeping her back to him as she stirred. "And root-cellared potatoes. Nothing fancy." "Fancy don't keep you alive." She glanced at him over her shoulder. A small, tight smile ghosted across her lips before she caught herself. "No, I suppose it doesn't." She went to the wooden hutch and pulled down 2 tin plates. The clatter of the metal was loud. She set them on the small, scarred pine table in the center of the room. She pulled out a chair. She hesitated, looking at the chair opposite it. Thomas's chair. She swallowed the lump in her throat and turned to Gavin. "Sit." Gavin walked to the table. He didn't sit immediately. He looked at the empty chair, then at Molly. He saw the slight tremor in her hands. He wasn't an educated man, but he wasn't blind to the ghosts that haunted a room. He reached for the chair, pulled it out, and sat down. The wood groaned under his weight. Molly ladled the thick stew onto the plates. She set one in front of him, along with a chunk of hard, dark bread. She poured 2 cups of black coffee from a dented tin pot. Then she sat down across from him. For a long minute, neither of them moved. The wind battered the log walls outside, a muffled, impotent rage. Inside, the only sound was the ticking of a mantel clock and the crackle of the wood in the stove. It was an unbearable, suffocating silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had forgotten how to be human in the presence of another. Gavin picked up his spoon. He didn't wait for a prayer. He took a bite. It was hot, rich, and tasted like salvation. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the warmth hit his stomach. "It's good," he said softly. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. Molly watched him eat. She picked up her own spoon, but her appetite was gone. She was acutely aware of his presence. He took up so much space, not just physically, but energetically. The cabin felt different. The shadows in the corners didn't seem so cold. "You never told me your name," she said. Gavin paused his spoon halfway to his mouth. Gavin Hayes. Molly Higgins. He nodded, acknowledging the trade. He went back to eating. He ate methodically, cleaning the plate with the piece of hard bread, not wasting a single drop of broth. When he finished, he set the spoon down and leaned back in the creaking chair, wrapping his large hands around the hot tin mug of coffee. "You live up on the ridge?" Molly asked. She was pushing. She didn't know why. Small talk was a foreign language to her now, but the silence felt too heavy to bear again. "Higher," Gavin said. "Wind River Range, trap beaver, hunt elk. Must be lonely." The word hit the table like a lead weight. Gavin looked at her, his dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the polite pretense. "Lonely is a choice, Mrs. Higgins," Gavin said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "A man goes up the mountain because he wants the quiet. He stays there because the quiet is the only thing that don't lie to him." Molly flinched. The cynicism in his voice mirrored her own dark thoughts over the last 10 months. "And what happens when the quiet starts talking back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gavin's jaw tightened. He looked down at his coffee. "You come down the mountain." He looked back up at her, and for the first time, Molly saw past the rough exterior. She saw a man who was just as broken, just as isolated as she was. He hid it behind buckskin and altitude. She hid it behind a shotgun and a failing farm. But sitting across from each other, over empty tin plates and the smell of wood smoke, the armor began to crack. The fire popped in the stove, a sharp crack that made them both jump. Gavin cleared his throat and stood up. The moment was getting too heavy, too close to a truth he wasn't ready to examine. "I should check on the mule. Make sure the barn door holds against the wind." Molly stood up quickly, too quickly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You don't have to go back out there. You can sleep by the stove. There's a rug." Gavin paused by the door. He had his hand on his heavy coat. The wind outside was rattling the window panes, a freezing death waiting in the dark. The warmth of the cabin, the smell of the meal, the fragile, terrifying connection they had just brushed against it, pulled at him. He looked at Molly. She was holding her breath, her blue eyes wide, waiting for his answer. She wasn't just offering shelter. She was offering a reprieve from the isolation that was killing them both. "I'll just secure the latch," Gavin said quietly. "I'll be right back." Molly let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She watched him pull on his coat and step back out into the roaring white maw of the storm. The door slammed shut, leaving her alone in the cabin once more. But as she cleared the tin plates from the table for the first time in 10 months, the silence didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a room waiting for someone to return. Gavin's return was marked by a violent shivering that he couldn't entirely suppress. He threw his weight against the heavy oak door, forcing it shut against a wind that felt like a solid, moving wall of ice. He dropped the heavy iron latch into place with a clank that finalized the barrier between life and death. He stood on the woven rag rug just inside the door, breathing hard. Snow caked his beard, his eyebrows, the broad shoulders of his coat. It was already melting in the dry heat of the cabin, leaving dark, wet patches on the floorboards. Molly was sitting in the rocking chair by the stove, an old woolen blanket pulled tight over her lap. She didn't say a word as he stripped off his gear. She watched him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. He unbuckled his gun belt, heavy with the Colt revolver and brass cartridges, and laid it deliberately on the small washstand. A silent demolition of peace. He unrolled his canvas bedroll on the floor, positioning it between the stove and the door. It was a strategic spot. Warmest place in the room, but also blocking the only exit. a habit born of sleeping in places where things tried to eat you in the dark. "Lamp oil is low," Molly said, her voice cutting through the ticking of the mantel clock. "I usually put it out before I sleep." "Put it out, then," Gavin replied. He pulled his boots off with a grunt. His wool socks were damp. He set the boots close enough to the iron to dry, but far enough away to keep the leather from cracking. Molly leaned over and blew out the glass lantern on the table. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness, saved only by the faint, pulsing orange glow leaking from the seams of the cast-iron stove. The wind screamed outside, a high-pitched, tearing sound as it whipped over the shingles. The log walls groaned under the pressure. Molly heard the heavy rustle of canvas and wool as Gavin settled onto the floor. She remained in the rocking chair. The bed was in the corner, separated from the main room by a faded calico curtain, but she couldn't bring herself to move toward it. An hour passed. The fire popped occasionally. "You awake?" Gavin's voice came from the floor. It was low, grating part of the shadows. "Yes." "You shouldn't sleep in a chair. Hurts the neck." "I've slept in worse places." Molly echoed his earlier words. She tightened her grip on the blanket. "Besides, I'm not sleeping." Silence stretched between them again. It wasn't the hostile silence of their first encounter, nor the awkward silence of dinner. It was a weary, battered silence. Two survivors sharing a foxhole while the artillery fell. "How long?" Gavin asked. Molly didn't need to ask what he meant. 10 months. March. Sickness. Men. Gavin shifted on the floorboards. The canvas rasped. "The kind with badges, or the kind without? The kind with empty bellies and loose morals," Molly said bitterly. "They came for the winter stores. Thomas went out with the shotgun. They shot him from the tree line. Took 3 sacks of flour, a cured ham, and the only good horse we had. Left him bleeding out in the mud." She spoke the words flatly, stripped of tears. The crying had been done in April. The anger had burned out in June. All that was left was this hollow, echoing exhaustion. "Sheriff do anything?" Molly let out a dry, humorless scoff. "Sheriff is a day's ride in good weather. By the time he got here, the snow had melted and the tracks were gone. He tipped his hat, told me he was sorry for my loss, and asked if I planned on selling the land. In the dim orange light, she saw Gavin sit up. He rested his forearms on his knees, staring at the glowing seams of the stove. "People are vultures," Gavin said. It wasn't an apology. It was an agreement. "And what are you, Mr. Hayes?" Molly asked. She turned her head, looking at his hulking silhouette. "You don't strike me as a man who stays in valleys. You live up where the air is thin. What chased you up there?" It was a dangerous question. Men out here killed over questions about their past. Gavin was quiet for a long time. The wind battered the glass window pane. "A war," he finally said. "A uniform. Orders I followed that I shouldn't have. Orders I gave that I can't take back." He rubbed a hand over his face, a rough sound in the dark. "Down here, everything's a negotiation. Who owes who? Who gets what? Up there, the mountain don't care what color your coat was. It just cares if your fire is hot and your aim is true. It's clean." Molly rested her head against the high wooden back of the rocking chair. "Clean is just another word for empty." Gavin didn't argue. He lay back down on the bedroll. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Higgins. The fire won't go out. I'll keep it fed." Molly closed her eyes. For the first time in 10 months, she didn't have to keep one ear tuned to the darkness outside. She didn't have to worry about the latch on the door or the dying embers in the stove. She fell asleep to the sound of a man breathing in her house. It was the heaviest sleep she had known since March. The cold woke him before the light did. Gavin's eyes snapped open. The fire had died down to a dull grey smolder. The ambient temperature in the cabin had plummeted. He sat up, his breath pluming in the dark air. The wind outside had changed pitch. It was no longer the violent, tearing scream of a blizzard. It was a steady, low moan. The storm was passing. He moved silently, not wanting to wake the woman in the bed behind the calico curtain. He opened the stove door, arranged a bed of kindling over the embers, and blew gently. A small orange flame caught, licked the dry bark and flared. He fed it 3 split logs from the pile he'd brought inside last night. The iron ticked as it heated. He stood up, stretching his stiff back. His joints ached. Sleeping on hardwood floors wasn't getting any easier. He walked to the window and wiped away the condensation and frost with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. It was dawn. The world outside was a blinding, featureless white. The snow had drifted against the front of the cabin, burying the porch completely. The woodpile they had labored over was barely visible, a slight mound in a sea of snow. Behind him, he heard the rustle of sheets. Molly stepped out from behind the curtain. She was wearing a heavy woolen sweater over her dress, her hair unbraided and falling in dark waves over her shoulders. She looked younger in the dim morning light, less brittle. "You let the fire get low," she murmured, pulling a shawl around her. Her voice was thick with sleep. "Only way to make a fire last the night without waking you to stoke it," Gavin replied, keeping his voice low. Molly walked to the stove and held her hands out. It stopped snowing. Mostly. The wind is just moving what's already on the ground now. Gavin turned away from the window. "We're buried in. Drift is halfway up the door." Molly sighed, a sound of profound fatigue. The endless grinding labor of winter. "There are shovels in the lean-to, assuming we can force the door open." Gavin didn't ask for permission. He walked to the door, threw the latch and pulled. The heavy oak moved an inch, then stopped dead against the packed snow on the porch. "Stand back," he grunted. He planted his boots, grabbed the iron handle with both hands, and threw his entire weight backward. The snow gave way with a heavy, muted crunch. A wall of white collapsed inward, spilling onto the rag rug. The cold hit them like a physical blow, sharper and more vicious than the night before. Gavin grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and used it to hack away the compacted snow, blocking the threshold, clearing enough space to squeeze out. Molly was right behind him, handing him his coat and gloves. "I'll make coffee. You dig to the lean-to." For the next 2 hours, the world was nothing but burning lungs and moving snow. Gavin retrieved the shovels. The drift was chest-high in places. He carved a trench from the porch to the barn, his shoulders screaming with every toss of the heavy, wet snow. Molly followed in his wake. She carried a bucket of hot water to thaw the frozen hinges on the barn doors. She didn't complain about the biting cold or the snow that seeped over the tops of her boots. When they finally wrenched the barn doors open, the smell of damp hay manure and animal heat rolled over them. It was a comforting stench. Rust Gavin's mule brayed angrily, kicking the side of his stall. "Miserable beast," Gavin muttered, walking over to check the animal's water trough. It was frozen solid. He broke the ice with the handle of his shovel. Molly hurried to the heifer's stall. The young cow was standing shivering but alive. The wire cut on her leg had scabbed over in the freezing air. Molly poured grain into the trough and leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the stall. "She made it," Molly whispered. Gavin stood a few feet away, leaning on his shovel. He watched her. The relief in her posture was palpable. The farm hadn't died today. Molly turned around and caught him watching her. She didn't look away. The silence between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was charged, heavy. She took a step toward him, intending to ask him to help carry the water bucket. Her foot hit a patch of black ice, hidden beneath a layer of loose straw. Her boots slipped out from under her. She let out a sharp gasp, her arms flailing. Gavin moved with a speed that belied his size. He dropped the shovel and lunged forward, catching her by the upper arms before she hit the hard-packed dirt floor. The momentum carried them both backward a half step. He held her suspended for a second, his massive hands gripping her through the thick wool of her sweater. They were close. Too close. Gavin could smell the lye soap in her hair, mixed with the sweat of the morning's labor. Molly looked up at him. His face was mere inches from hers. She saw the deep lines around his eyes, the grey in his beard, the raw, chapped skin of his cheeks. She felt the incredible, immovable strength in his hands. His grip was hard, capable of breaking a man's neck, but he held her with a terrifying gentleness. For 3 seconds, neither of them breathed. The world shrank down to the dust motes, dancing in the shaft of sunlight, piercing the barn roof and the steady thudding rhythm of Gavin's heart against Molly's arm. Gavin pulled her upright. He released her immediately, stepping back as if he had touched a hot stove. "Ice," he said roughly. His voice was deeper than usual. "Yes," Molly breathed. She smoothed the front of her coat, suddenly acutely aware of how disheveled she looked. "Thank you." Gavin picked up his shovel. He didn't look at her. "I'll muck the stalls. You take the bucket inside. Fire needs tending." He turned his back to her, driving the shovel into a pile of soiled hay. Molly stood there for a moment, her skin still burning where his hands had been. She picked up the wooden bucket and walked out of the barn. The air was freezing, but her blood was rushing loud and hot in her ears. Breakfast was a quiet affair, eaten out of necessity rather than enjoyment. Molly cooked a skillet of cornmeal mush and fried the last of her salt pork. The cabin was warm, the fire roaring in the stove, but the atmosphere had shifted. The storm was over. The brilliant, blinding sunlight reflected off the unbroken sea of snow outside, flooding the small cabin with a harsh, unforgiving light. It illuminated the dust, the water stains on the ceiling, the poverty of the place. It also illuminated the stark reality of their situation. The crisis had passed. The reason for Gavin's presence was gone. Gavin finished his coffee, set the tin cup on the table and stood up. "I owe you for the meal." Molly kept her eyes on her half-empty plate. "You chopped my wood and dug out my barn. We're even, Mr. Hayes." Gavin walked over to the washstand. He picked up his gun belt. The sound of the heavy leather and clinking brass was deafening in the quiet room. He buckled it around his waist, checking the seating of the Colt in its holster. It was a practiced automatic motion. Molly watched him from the table. Every buckle fastened, every strap tightened, felt like a door slamming shut. He moved to the stove and pulled his heavy buffalo coat from the peg. It was dry now, stiff and smelling of wood smoke. He shrugged into it, the sheer bulk of the garment making him look wild again, untethered from the domesticity of the cabin. "Road to Bitter Creek is going to be deep," Gavin said, turning his hat in his hands. "Take me most of the day to break trail." "You're leaving now." It wasn't a question. Got pelts to sell, flour to buy. Molly stood up. She began clearing the plates, her movements jerky and tense. "Well, you'd best get started then. The days are short." She walked to a small wooden box on the shelf above the sink. She opened it, fumbled around inside, and pulled out a silver dollar. It was the last piece of hard currency she had to her name. She walked over to Gavin and held it out. Gavin looked at the coin, then at her face. His jaw muscles tightened. "I told you yesterday I don't want your money, and I told you men don't work for free." Molly countered, her chin lifting defiantly. "You dug out my barn. Take the money." "Put it away, Molly." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his rough tongue made her breath hitch. "I don't take charity." she snapped, forcing the anger to mask the sudden, terrifying swell of panic in her chest. She pushed the coin toward him. "Take it and go." Gavin didn't move his hands. He looked down at her. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. He understood what she was doing. She was building the wall back up. She was turning him back into a transaction, a hired hand, a stranger, because strangers leaving didn't hurt. "Keep your money," Gavin said softly. By seed in the spring, he stepped past her. He pulled open the heavy oak door. The freezing air rushed in, sweeping away the warmth of the cabin, smelling of pine needles and ozone. He walked out onto the cleared porch and began descending the trench toward the barn to saddle his mule. Molly stood in the doorway. She held the silver dollar so tightly it dug into her palm. She watched him walk away, his broad back, the confident, heavy placement of his boots in the snow. She had survived 10 months by being hard, by expecting the worst from men and nature. She had accepted that she would likely die on this farm, frozen or starved, but she would die on her own terms. But as she watched Gavin disappear into the shadows of the barn, a cold dread settled in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that the silence in the cabin was going to return. And this time, it wouldn't just be empty. It would be entirely unendurable. She heard the rattle of harnesses from the barn. A few minutes later, Gavin emerged, leading Rust. The mule was loaded down with heavy canvas packs of pelts. Gavin held the lead rope, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He stopped at the edge of the yard where the trench ended, and the unbroken snow began. He didn't look back at the cabin. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick pair of leather gloves, and pulled them on. Molly took a step out onto the porch. The cold bit through her sweater instantly, but she didn't feel it. Gavin put his hand on the mule's saddle horn. He took a deep breath of the freezing air, looking out toward the valley and the long, brutal slog to Bitter Creek. He had a cabin up in the Wind Rivers, a fire pit, quiet, safety. He just had to put one foot in front of the other. He had done it 1,000 times before. Walk away. Leave the valleys and the desperate people to their own fates. He lifted his boot to break the trail. Gavin. The word cracked like a rifle shot across the snow. Gavin froze. He stood with his back to her for a long second. Then slowly he turned his head. Molly was standing on the edge of the porch. She wasn't holding the rifle. She wasn't holding the silver dollar. Her hands were empty, resting at her sides. She was shivering, the wind whipping her dark hair across her pale face. She looked at him across the 30 yards of cleared snow. All the pride, all the bitterness, all the armor she had spent the last year forging lay shattered on the floorboards behind her. "The roof on the lean-to needs fixing," Molly said. Her voice trembled, but she forced it loud enough to carry over the wind. "It won't hold another heavy snow." Gavin stood completely still. His hand tightened on the lead rope. "I don't have money to pay a carpenter," she continued, her voice catching in her throat. She swallowed hard and lifted her chin, staring him down with terrified, desperate eyes. "But I have flour and coffee, and I can cook." The silence stretched between them. The wind howled through the pine trees on the ridge. Gavin looked at the woman on the porch. He looked at the sagging roof of the lean-to. He looked down the valley toward the trading post, toward the empty cold mountain waiting for him. He slowly lowered his boot back into the trench. Gavin didn't unpack the mule right away. He tied Rust to the corral fence, walked to the lean-to, and spent 10 minutes staring up at the sagging roofline. He tested the support beams with a gloved hand. The wood was spongy with rot. When he finally walked back into the cabin, Molly had a fresh pot of coffee boiling. She didn't say a word about him staying. She just poured him a cup and set it on the table. It was an unspoken truce, a fragile contract drawn up in flour and timber. The next 3 weeks settled into a rhythm dictated by the brutal Wyoming winter and the relentless demands of the farm. Gavin dismantled the ruined section of the lean-to roof. He waded into the timberline behind the cabin, felling straight, thick lodgepole pines. He stripped the bark with a draw knife, the sharp, clean scent of pine sap cutting through the bitter cold. Molly watched him from the kitchen window. The sight of him working the sheer physical capability of the man began to loosen a knot in her chest she hadn't realized she was carrying. He wasn't loud. He didn't boast. He just worked until the daylight failed, took his supper quietly, and slept by the door. He was a ghost who chopped wood. But slowly the ghost began to take on flesh. It started in the small things. Molly found herself anticipating his habits. She learned he liked his coffee black, boiled, until it was thick enough to strip paint. She learned he favored his left knee. When the barometric pressure dropped a limp, he tried to hide, but couldn't completely disguise. One evening in late January, the wind was howling a familiar murderous tune outside. The cabin was hot-smelling of roasting venison from a buck Gavin had dropped 2 days prior. Molly sat in the rocking chair, her lap full of Gavin's heavy canvas trousers. He had snagged them on a rogue nail, tearing a jagged hole near the thigh. Gavin sat at the table using his hunting knife to carve a new handle for her broken butter churn out of a piece of seasoned ash. "You don't have to mend those," Gavin said, not looking up from the wood. The firelight flickered across the deep scars on his face. "I can patch them with a piece of rawhide." "Rawhide stiffens in the cold," Molly said, her needle pulling thick black thread through the heavy fabric. "It'll chafe you raw. Takes 10 minutes to do it right." Gavin stopped carving. He looked at her. It was a long, unreadable look. "Nobody's done it right for me in a long time." Molly kept her eyes on her work. Her fingers were nimble, practiced. "You said you were in the war. You have family back east." "Habd." The word was final. A closed door. But a moment later, the door creaked open an inch. "A wife. Ohio. Cholera took her in '64 while I was sitting in a trench outside Petersburg. Got a letter about it 3 months after they buried her." Molly's hand stilled. She looked up. The grief in his eyes wasn't fresh, but it was deep, fossilized into his bones. It was the same kind of grief she saw in the mirror every morning. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. Was a lifetime ago." Gavin resumed his carving, the knife taking long, smooth curls of wood off the ash. "Came out west after the discharge. Figured if I went high enough, the world wouldn't be able to reach me." "Did it work?" Gavin blew the sawdust off the new handle. He looked around the small, warm cabin, his eyes finally resting on Molly. "For a while." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The silence that fell over the room wasn't the suffocating heavy blanket it had been a month ago. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood the exact shape of each other's scars. By mid-February, the lean-to was finished. It was sturdier than the original, built with mortise and tenon joints that would hold a foot of wet snow without groaning. The woodpile was replenished. The heifer was putting on weight. Gavin's excuse for staying was gone. He knew it. Molly knew it. Yet neither spoke of it. The mornings began to stretch. The sun rose a little earlier, casting a pale, watery yellow light over the valley. The icicles hanging from the eaves began to drip at midday, a rhythmic, maddening tink, tink, tink that signaled the approaching thaw. One afternoon, Gavin came back from checking his snare line, holding a brace of fat rabbits. He stomped the slush from his boots on the porch. The snow was losing its dry, powdery consistency, turning heavy and grey. He walked inside. Molly was at the stove. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped. "Your hand," she said, her voice sharp. Gavin looked down. The back of his left hand was coated in fresh, bright blood. He hadn't even felt it. He flexed his fingers. "Caught a splinter off a deadfall. It's nothing." "Sit down," Molly ordered. Gavin opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eye killed the words in his throat. He sat heavily in the chair. Molly brought a basin of warm water and a clean rag to the table. She took his hand. Her fingers were small, warm and calloused from farm work. She washed the blood away with careful, deliberate strokes. The cut was jagged, a nasty tear across the knuckles, but not deep enough for stitches. Gavin watched her face as she worked. She was biting her lower lip in concentration. She smelled of flour and lavender soap. He felt a sudden, terrifying tightness in his chest. It was a feeling he had spent a decade trying to freeze out of his system. "Hold still," she murmured, reaching for a tin of drawing salve. "Molly," he said. His voice was a low rasp. She stopped. She didn't look up, but he felt her pulse jump where her fingers rested against his wrist. "The snow is crusting over," Gavin said, the words tasting like ash. "Pass is going to be clear enough for a mule in a week." Molly kept her eyes on the cut. She applied the salve with meticulous care. "I know. Roof is fixed. Wood's cut. I know," she repeated, her voice tighter this time. She grabbed a strip of clean white linen and began wrapping his hand. She pulled the bandage tight, maybe a little too tight. "You're a free man, Gavin. Nobody is keeping you here." She tied off the bandage and finally looked up at him. Her blue eyes were shining, but her jaw was set in stone. She was waiting for him to break her heart. She had already prepared herself for it. Gavin looked at his bandaged hand, then at her. He wanted to tell her that the mountain felt empty now. He wanted to tell her that the smell of her coffee was better than any high country sunrise. But the words were trapped beneath a lifetime of leaving. Before he could find them, the sound of a horse whinnying shattered the quiet. It wasn't the heavy braying complaint of rust. It was a horse, and it was right outside the cabin. Gavin moved. He didn't stand up. He practically flowed out of the chair. In a single fluid motion, he snatched the Colt revolver from its holster on the washstand. The heavy brass cylinder spun with a sharp clack as he checked the loads. Molly's heart hammered in her throat. The domestic softness of the moment evaporated, replaced by the stark, violent reality of the frontier. She didn't scream. She stepped to the corner, grabbed her Winchester, and levered a round into the chamber. Gavin pressed his back against the wall beside the front window. He peered through a small gap in the frost-rimed glass. 3 riders. He muttered, his voice dead of all emotion. It was the voice of a soldier. Rough-looking. Horses are blown. They've been pushing hard. "Rustlers," Molly whispered, gripping the rifle. "Or drifters. Same difference when they're hungry." Gavin looked at her. "Get away from the glass. Stand by the stove. If they come through that door, you shoot the first thing that casts a shadow." "What are you doing?" "I'm going to introduce myself." Gavin didn't wait for her to argue. He slid to the heavy oak door, slipped the latch silently, and yanked it open. He stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door cracked behind him. The 3 men were in the yard. The snow was heavily trampled where they had halted their mounts. They wore heavy canvas dusters, stained dark with mud and snowmelt. The man in the center, riding a rangy roan gelding, had a thick, greasy mustache and a Sharps rifle resting casually across his saddle horn. They looked at the cabin. They expected a terrified widow. They did not expect a mountain of a man with a drawn Colt and eyes like chipped flint. "That's far enough," Gavin's voice boomed over the yard. It didn't waver. The man on the roan pulled back on his reins. His eyes darted to Gavin's hands, calculating the odds. "Easy, friend. We're just looking for a little hospitality. Storm caught us in the lower pass." "Nearest hospitality is Bitter Creek, 12 miles east," Gavin said. He didn't raise the revolver, but the barrel was angled perfectly to cut the man in half. "Now that's a long ride for tired horses," the rider on the left said. He was younger, with a nervous energy that made Gavin's finger tighten on the trigger. His hand was resting entirely too close to the revolver on his hip. "We heard this place belonged to a widow woman. Figured she might have some oats to spare. Maybe some hot food." It was the tone that gave them away. The lazy, predatory drawl of men who took what they wanted from those who couldn't stop them. It was the exact same tone Molly had described when she told him about Thomas. "You heard wrong," Gavin said flatly. "Farm's occupied, and we're out of oats." The leader spat a stream of tobacco juice into the muddy snow. His smile faded. "You don't look like a dirt farmer, mister. You look like a man who's a long way from home." "I'm exactly where I need to be." "I don't think you are." The leader shifted his weight in the saddle. The Sharps rifle began to level. Gavin didn't wait. He had survived the wilderness campaign and 10 years in grizzly country by never letting the other man take the first shot. The Colt roared. The blast echoed off the valley walls like a cannon shot. The leader jerked backward, a dark hole appearing in his canvas duster, right where his shoulder met his collarbone. He dropped the Sharps, screaming, and slid out of the saddle, hitting the slushy ground hard. Chaos erupted. The young rider on the left clawed for his gun, fighting his terrified rearing horse. Gavin cocked the hammer and fired again. The bullet took the young man in the thigh. He wailed his horse, spinning out of control and bolting toward the timberline, dragging the rider half out of the stirrups. The third man didn't try to draw. He saw the cold, mechanical efficiency of the big man on the porch. He yanked his horse's head around, spurred it mercilessly, and bolted back down the trail toward the main valley. Gavin tracked him with the Colt, his thumb pulling back the hammer, but he didn't fire. A fleeing man wasn't a threat. The yard fell completely silent, save for the moaning of the wounded leader thrashing in the bloody snow. Gavin stood on the porch, the smoke from the black powder drifting around him, stinging his eyes. His breathing was heavy measured. He kept the gun leveled at the man on the ground. The door creaked open wider. Molly stepped out onto the porch. She held the Winchester at her shoulder, her face pale, but her hands were rock steady. She looked at the man bleeding in her yard. She looked down the trail where the others had fled. Then she looked at Gavin. He hadn't flinched. He had stepped between her and the violence of the world and handled it with a terrifying, absolute finality. Gavin lowered the hammer on the Colt. He holstered the weapon. He walked down the steps into the mud, grabbed the wounded man by the collar of his duster, and hauled him roughly to his feet. The man screamed in pain. "Get on your horse," Gavin growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "If you make it to the doctor in Bitter Creek, you tell him you tripped. If I ever see you or your friends in this valley again, I won't aim for the shoulder." "You understand me?" The man nodded frantically, his face grey with shock. Gavin hoisted him onto the roan. The man grabbed the saddle horn, groaning, and spurred the horse down the trail, swaying wildly. Gavin stood in the mud and watched him until he disappeared around the bend. He turned back to the cabin. Molly was standing on the steps. She slowly lowered the rifle. "They won't come back," Gavin said, wiping a fleck of blood from his cheek. "No," Molly said softly. "They won't." She looked at him. The buckskin, the scars, the gun. He was a violent man. But for the first time in her life, the violence didn't terrify her. It made her feel safe. "You're bleeding," she said. Gavin looked down. The scab on his knuckles had torn open during the draw. "It's nothing." "Come inside, Gavin," Molly said. It wasn't a request, it was a claim. Spring broke over the Wyoming Territory, not with a whisper, but with a roar. The snowmelt turned the creek at the edge of the property into a raging torrent of brown water. The mud was deep, clinging to boots and hooves like thick grease. But beneath the mud, the first green shoots of prairie grass were pushing their way toward the sun. Gavin stood by the corral running a curry comb over Rust's flanks. The mule tolerated it with a lazy flick of his ears. The heavy winter coat was shedding out in clumps. The pass was open. The high country was calling. Gavin had spent the morning looking up at the Wind River Range. The peaks were still white, sharp, and brilliantly clear against the blue sky. The silence up there was absolute. No rustlers, no rot, no debt. He tossed the comb into a wooden bucket and rested his arms on the top rail of the fence. He didn't want to go. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent 10 years running from the pain of losing his wife, from the horrors of the war, convinced that isolation was the only cure for a broken spirit. But the mountain hadn't healed him. It had just frozen him in place. It was the widow in the sagging cabin who had thawed him out. He turned around. Molly was walking toward him from the house. She wasn't wearing her heavy woolen coat anymore. She wore a simple cotton dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The grim skeletal look she had carried in December was gone. Her face had filled out her cheeks, holding a natural, healthy color. She carried a tin cup of coffee. She walked up to the fence, stood beside him, and handed it to him. "Smells like mud," Molly said, looking out over the lower pasture. "Smells like planting season," Gavin corrected, taking a sip of the scalding black coffee. They stood shoulder to shoulder. The physical distance between them had eroded to nothing over the last month. They were a single unit, a machine forged in the brutal crucible of winter. "You didn't pack the mule," Molly said quietly. "No." "The trail is clear to the high timber." Gavin tightened his grip on the tin cup. He looked down at her. She was looking out at the valley, refusing to meet his eyes. He saw the tension in her jaw. She was giving him the out. She was brave enough to let him walk away, if that was what he needed. "I know it is," Gavin said. "Then why are you standing here?" Gavin Hayes. He set the cup down on the fence post. He turned his body entirely toward her. He reached out with his large, scarred hand and gently took her chin, turning her face toward his. Her blue eyes were wide, searching his face. "Because a man can only freeze for so long before he realizes he's dead," Gavin said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "And I don't want to be dead anymore." Molly's breath hitched. A single tear broke free, tracking down her cheek, but she wasn't crying from sorrow. "The farm is hard work," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The soil is rocky. The winters are long." "I ain't afraid of hard work, Molly. And I don't want a hired hand." "Good, because I'm not asking for wages." He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't offer a flowery demolition of love. He was a mountain man, and she was a widow who had survived the worst the world could throw at her. They didn't need poetry. They needed roots. Gavin lowered his head and kissed her. It was a grounded, firm kiss. It tasted of strong coffee and the sharp, clean air of the thaw. Molly closed her eyes, letting her hands rise to grip the thick canvas of his shirt. She anchored herself to him, and he anchored himself to her. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. They stood there in the mud, surrounded by the wreckage of winter and the promise of spring. "The lower 40 needs ploughing," Gavin murmured. Molly smiled, a real radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Then you'd better stop kissing me and go grease the plough, Mr. Hayes." Gavin let out a rough, barking laugh. He stepped back, picked up his coffee, and looked up at the mountain one last time. It was beautiful. It was majestic. and it meant absolutely nothing to him anymore. He turned his back on the high country and walked toward the barn. He had a home to build. If Gavin and Molly's journey through the brutal winter touched your heart, make sure to give this video a like and hit that share button. We love bringing you these grounded, deeply human stories of frontier survival and second chances. What do you think you would have done in Molly's shoes when the rustlers arrived? Let us know down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale from the wild, untamed West.